So I want to say hi to all of you from wherever you're joining us for this first of two APSG meetings this June. It's a little afternoon here in Washington. If there are any of you who haven't met me, I'm Jim Finkel. I'm one of the co-founders of the Atrocity Prevention Study Group, and I'm the person that organizes all of our monthly meetings. I want to welcome all of you to today's discussion of the initial findings from our What Measures Work project. The origins of this project go back to a discussion I had a little over 2 years ago with a colleague from the State Department's Conflict and Stabilization Bureau. One of the things that has made this project especially challenging was the need to find a partner willing to let independent outsiders look under the hood of a program that they were implementing and provide an unvarnished appraisal. Mercy Corps was willing to work with our presenters within those parameters, and we're just extraordinarily grateful for their cooperation. I want to note that we will be recording today's initial presentations with our presenters' permission, and that we will later be posting that recording on the Stimson Center's APSG page. We will not be recording any part of the Q&A. I'd also like to remind everyone as we get started that all of our discussion will be unclassified. During the Q&A part of our meeting, we will be operating under Chatham House rules. You may take notes, but you should not refer to individuals by name. Some of you may have noted that we've added a list of recent books and articles that we think might be of interest to our invitation in our registration form. I've specifically done that in response to requests from some of our government colleagues. If you come across books and articles in the future that you would like me to flag, please let me know. I want to turn now to introducing our presenters, Professors Ben Valentino and Or Corin. Ben is a professor of government at Dartmouth College and chair of the Department of Government. His research interests include the causes and consequences of violent conflict in American foreign policy and security policies. At Dartmouth, he teaches courses on international relations, international security, American foreign policy, the causes and prevention of genocide, and serves as co-director of the Government Department Honors Program. He is also the faculty coordinator for the War and Peace Studies program at Dartmouth's Dickey Center for International Understanding. He's currently working on several research projects focusing on public opinion on the use of force and developing early warning models of large-scale violence against civilians. Or is an assistant professor of international relations and methodology in the Department of Political Science at Indiana University's Bloomington campus. He won the Outstanding Junior Faculty Member for 2022. He completed his PhD at the University of Minnesota, where he also obtained a Master of Science in Applied Economics. Within international relations, his research has involved innovative approaches to studying the causes of civil conflict, with an emphasis on how environmental pressures shape patterns of political violence. His methodological interests include limited dependent variable models, econometric and causal inference models, mixed and combined methods approaches, and event data. His research has attracted the support of the National Science Foundation, the Henry Frank Guggenheim Foundation, the Dickey Center at Dartmouth, and the United States Institute of Peace, among others. We also have a couple members of the Mercy Corps team with us this morning. In particular, although he's not here yet, I want to note Adam Lichtenheld, who has worked closely with Ben and Or. Adam is a senior researcher for peace and conflict at Mercy Corps, a visiting fellow at the Feinstein International Center at Tufts University, and a research fellow in the Center for International Security at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin, Germany. His research focuses on population displacement, civil war, political violence, and peace building. Adam has conducted extensive field work in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. I want to welcome all of you and thank you again for joining us this morning. I've got a couple of additional housekeeping comments. Ilhan Dahir, my colleague at the Stimson Center, will be running today's Zoom call. Ilhan will keep everyone but the person presenting muted. We'll hold all questions until our presenters have finished their presentations. To facilitate discussion, I will ask those participants using the video Zoom link to signal me using the raise hand function when they'd like to raise a question or comment. I will take questions and comments in the order that I see you. Please give us your name after I call on you and which of our speakers you would like to address your question or comment to. For those of you just using the Zoom link audio, please use the chat feature to raise question or comment. Ilhan will share the questions in the order that they are received. And with that, Ben and Orr, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Jim. I'm going to share my screen. So let's make sure that's working first, and then I'll get into the presentation. So here we go. Can you tell me whether that looks like that's working? So can you give me a thumbs up if it
Yeah, that's good, Ben.
is visible and large enough to see? Okay.
Yeah, it's great.
Excellent. Let me just rearrange some windows here on my desktop, and then I will get us started. Okay, so today I'm gonna talk about this project, which, as Jim said, is a part of the What Measures Work project, and it's research that I did. And although I'll be presenting, I'm really standing in for a team of collaborators here, some of whom Jim has already mentioned, including Orr Corin, who's here and has helped with a lot of the data analysis. Adam Lichtenheld, who's not on the call right now, but will be joining us shortly from Mercy Corps. And then really the two folks who did all of the important research on the ground, who are with us. One here on the call, Danjuma Dewup Saidu, and the other, I think I saw his name, although I haven't seen his face, Andrew Abenye Ame. So those are our two team members in Nigeria working with our partner to actually deliver the survey results that we're going to talk about today. So thanks again to all of the team members here, and I'll echo Jim's thanks to Mercy Corps for being willing to collaborate with us on this research project. I hope it's going to be a fruitful collaboration for all of us. So before I get into it, we've got a standard disclaimer, which is just to say, remind you these data were collected as part of a project that was funded by USAID and implemented by Mercy Corps in Nigeria. But the views that I will be reporting here do not reflect, or at least do not necessarily reflect, those of USAID or the US government. I'll add a personal disclaimer here, which is we're going to be talking about a lot of things that are going on in the Middle Belt region of Nigeria. I am not a Nigeria expert, and neither is Orr, but we were fortunate again to have some members on our team who really are experts on these regions, part because they live there and experience what's going on there every day. And so we benefited enormously from their advice in this project. And I expect if you have questions that relate to what's going on there on the ground, I'm going to direct you to those collaborators if you ask them. But I think that's important to say at the outset. Okay. So this project, it emerged as many good ideas do in conversation with Jim Finkel, as we were both, I think, lamenting the lack of good social science on what kind of atrocity prevention measures actually work. And Jim and I were saying, it's really interesting how sophisticated some of the research has become around the subject of early warning for atrocity. Lots of high-level work being done there, but really much, much less effort being devoted to trying to understand what to do once we get that warning, and whether whether there are ways that would succeed in reducing the number of atrocities that we experience. every year. Why are we lagging so far behind there? Why don't we really know what works? And that's a particularly important question, I think, right now, because as most people on this call know, over the last couple of years, the last 3 or 4 years, the United States has made some really unprecedented commitments to atrocity prevention and generally conflict prevention around the world. And that includes things like the Genocide and Atrocity Prevention Act and the Global Fragility Act, which have together provided over $1 billion in funds for violence prevention. And these efforts, I think, kind of culminated in the 2020 United States Strategy to Prevent Conflict and Promote Stability, which was amended in 2022 with an important prologue defining this kind of 10-year whole of government plan by the United States to foster peace and stability in countries that are at risk for violence and atrocity. So not just limited to genocide and other atrocities, but certainly that kind of violence, an important focus of these efforts. And one of the key components of this strategy, which warmed my heart, was a real clear commitment, not just to try to do something about this problem, but to try to assess those efforts so that we can determine what works, not just so as this little excerpt says, we can protect the US taxpayers' dollar. That's an important thing to do. But I think even more important, so that we can understand what works and what doesn't, so that we can do more of what works in the future and less of what doesn't, so that we can make the biggest difference we possibly can make. And so I see the effort that I'm going to talk to you about today as part of that broader effort to try to bring the tools of social science to the field of atrocity prevention. So let me say a few words now about the intervention and the context in Nigeria in which the project is being undertaken. And then I'll talk specifically about our efforts to develop a research design to assess the effectiveness of the intervention. So the intervention is called PARTNER, which stands for the Peace Action for Rapid and Transformative Nigerian Early Response. It's kind of a mouthful, but we'll just call it a PARTNER from here on out. And it's a project that was funded by USAID in August of 2021 and is scheduled to run for the next 5 years. Now, PARTNER is focused specifically on reducing political violence in Nigeria's Middle Belt region, specifically in 2 Nigerian states, Kaduna and Plateau. And as most of you probably know, this area of Nigeria has really been racked by repeated violence on a variety of fronts for the last 2 decades, a really extraordinarily violent place. And the drivers of these conflicts are diverse, but much of it can be traced really to 2 main sources. First, we have the conflict that has come to be described as conflict between herders and farmers, with the herders often from the Fulani ethnic group. And a second kind of conflict that goes by various different names. Sometimes it's called conflict due to armed gangs, or in the local parlance, more often just called banditry. And these are groups that engage in cattle rustling, kidnapping, other kinds of violent attacks against civilians in these areas. Many of these gangs actually formed in response to conflicts over land between herders and farmers. And so they're quite related. Many of these gangs are also predominantly Fulani. And so again, the 2 kinds of violence are not completely separate. Now, although the vast majority of Fulani are Muslim and most farmers are in these areas are Christian, I'll show you in a moment that at least the people in the communities that we surveyed really don't seem to think of this violence as primarily religiously motivated. They do think of it as a conflict over land and resources and about criminality, rather than a conflict about religion per se. Instead, we see groups that happen to be divided by religion, fighting over things that are not themselves identity related. We can talk more about that when we get to that part. So you can see a little sense of both where Kaduna and Plateau are, if you don't know the geography of Nigeria, and the different forms of violence that we see across Nigeria, but again, especially in Kaduna and Plateau. And the thing to take away from this is that, you could look in the northeast quadrant of Nigeria. That's really where, especially recently, Boko Haram attacks have been primarily limited to the northeast. But in Kaduna and Plateau, most of the violence is that blue shaded violence, which are these criminal gangs, the banditry, or the green shaded violence, which are those herder-farmer conflicts. And you could see that's really a center of that kind of violence in Nigeria. Here's a map using a different set of data. The previous data came from ACLED. These data are quite similar, but come from a different source, the Nigeria Security Tracker, which is run by the Council on Foreign Relations, that shows us about the last 10 years of violence across these regions, using a definition of violence that focuses on politically organized violence, but it overlaps fairly closely with the ACLED definition. And the main thing to just see is that there's been quite a lot of it across both states over the last 10 years, and a lot of variation in the kinds of attacks that we see. The average attack in this data set kills, I think, the median attack kills something like 2 people. But you can see that there are some attacks that kill 50, 100, or sometimes even hundreds of people. So these are true atrocities in the sense of that word. And if you were to add up all of these deaths over the last 10 years, you get something around 9,000 deaths. And I suspect that's actually an undercount of the total number of people who have been killed just in Kaduna and Plateau from these sorts of violence. So that's the situation into which Partner is stepping. So what exactly is Partner going to do? We'll talk about that before we talk about how we're going to assess whether or not it works. And again, I'm going to turn it in the Q&A to my colleagues from Mercy Corps, who could say a lot more about exactly what will be going on in the ground with Partner. But I'll give you a kind of 30,000 foot overview of it right now, focusing primarily on the question of what it does in the area of early warning and response. Although you'll see as we talk a little bit more, the project also has a kind of secondary aim to promote social cohesion, which we think is likely correlated with better early warning and response. But I'm going to focus primarily in this conversation about the early warning side of it. Happy to talk more about the social cohesion side when we get to the Q&A. And maybe the most important thing to say before I get into the particular details of what Partner will do is that many of these details have not yet been entirely worked out. And that's because from the very beginning, Partner was committed to ensuring that it will work closely with local stakeholders in these communities to try to design the kind of system that will be most useful to those communities. And so what's going on right now, literally this stage of the project in Nigeria, now we've completed the initial survey to get a baseline. we're now in the phase in which we're gathering information and working with local stakeholders to try to understand how best to construct the system that we'll ultimately deploy. But we do know several key aspects of the program that will certainly be a part of the final system, even though, as I say, some of the details are yet to be worked out. I'm just going to talk about 5 of those aspects of the system. So the first, it will establish a reporting mechanism, and that mechanism is designed to try to organize local groups that already exist to try to prevent violence, to better recognize signs of violence, and to train them on how to report that violence to the partner system when it's up and running. Second, it works on the analysis and integration of that information. So one of the most interesting things about Partner is its plan to establish what we're calling a situation room, where information on violent conflict that comes in from all the different partner communities can be reported and integrated and analyzed, and then sent both up and down, up to state and national level authorities, and down towards responders in the local community level, so that they can use that information to try to act on warnings when they come out. Third is an effort to improve the response capabilities of local actors to violence. And so there are training efforts for a variety of different groups involved in response to warning, because of course it does no good to warn about violence if you can't respond to it. Fourth, there is an effort to expand and improve the communication of warning and the engagement of individual residents of these communities in the warning system. That will include an effort to deploy some social media platforms in this regard, and to use SMS messaging to get early warning out when we have solid evidence that violence might be in the offing. And then lastly, like I said, there's a variety of social cohesion programming that will be implemented in at least some of the partner communities. And that programming will be based on the kind of training that Mercy Corps has been doing both in Nigeria and around the world, and is really one of the leading experts on, and has been for decades. So that's the kind of 30,000-foot view of what the system is actually going to look like. And as I said, the real details of exactly how it's going to work are literally being worked out as we speak, and in the next month or so before the program is implemented. And I'll just say one last thing, which is that Partner is really designed eventually to provide these capabilities to local stakeholders so that they can take over and Mercy Corps can step back. So Mercy Corps is taking the lead in a kind of mentorship capacity for the first 2 years of the program. But after that period is going to turn over leadership to some local partners who will carry on with the project for the next 3 years. And hopefully after that as well. One of the efforts of the program is to try to make sure that the project doesn't end after 5 years, but to make sure that there's continued funding and engagement in the project going forward. Okay, so I want to emphasize that all of this that I've talked about really was created before Orr and I joined the project at all. So we really had a very little, if any, role in designing what Partner would look like. And instead, our role really is to ask, given this really quite impressive effort to provide warning in Nigeria, in Plateau and Kaduna, how can we evaluate how well it's actually going to work? And so that's what I want to focus on now for the next half of the presentation. And to do that, we decided to try to design a randomized controlled trial, what I believe is the first true randomized controlled trial in the atrocity prevention area. It's possible there are others, although I've not seen certainly any published work talking about a randomized controlled trial to assess atrocity prevention and nothing to assess atrocity early warning. So I think there'll be two ways that this is really a first of its kind project. And to do that, we divided the 50 communities that are part of the partner program into 3 groups. And this map shows you each of those communities color-coded by which group they belong to. So group 1 will receive early warning, the early warning system and social cohesion programming immediately. So starting in the next few months. Group 2 will receive just the early warning programming immediately. And group 3 will eventually receive at least the early warning programming, potentially the social cohesion programming as well, depends on the results of the first year or so of the project, but they will not receive it for another year or so. And so the idea is that we'll have a head start on partner in these first communities. There'll be 20 in group 1 and 15 in group 2 and another 15 in group 3. And if the partner programming is effective in a variety of different ways, we'll talk about different ways we might measure that, then we should expect to see various things, rates of violence, most importantly, decline in the communities in group 1 and group 2 before they decline in the control communities in group 3. And then hopefully when the program is implemented in group 3, witness a similar decline in those communities as well. And so that's the basic setup of the RCT. To measure the outcomes here that we care about, we first obviously have to establish a baseline. How are things right now in these 3 different groups, so that we can later ask what's changed since the intervention happens. And to do that, Mercy Corps and our partners in Nigeria just finished, I think we got the final results just under 3 weeks ago, just finished a survey of 2,600 residents of these 50 communities in Kaduna and Plateau. And so what I'm going to do now is kind of walk you through those results so you can get a sense of where these communities stand now, where the sources of the violence are, and some sense about the challenges that early warning and partner in general face in these communities. Of course, I won't be able to tell you yet whether the project has worked or not, because we're really just looking at the baseline. We're asking, what do we have to work with? What needs to be improved upon? I'm going to start by just showing you briefly here the demographics of our sample. These are the 2,600 respondents to our survey. And the main thing I just want to say about this is, although our demographics from this part of Nigeria are not great, everything that I could find suggests that we've pretty closely matched the demographics in these communities. So we're seeing a split that looks quite similar to the ones that other studies in these areas have found, both by the demographics of our subjects based on sex, age, and religion, and by community size, which includes some rural and some urban, and some communities on the edge of urban and rural areas. One thing I will point to is, you'll note, so again, this is in the Middle Belt region of Nigeria, where we tend to see the population roughly equally divided between Muslim and Christian populations. And that, in fact, is what we see in our sample as well. And I'll show you that in a different way here on this map. So these, again, are the 50 communities. I know you can't read all the names of those communities, but I think that's less important than to just look at the color of the dots here in the communities, with the darker red dots being communities in which a greater percentage of the respondents to our survey said they were Christian, and the yellow dots, the communities that have a higher proportion of Muslim respondents. And you can see there's quite a bit of variation across the communities that we surveyed. And again, I'll talk a bit about how important those divisions are in terms of the kind of violence that we see in the kind of reaction that our communities have to the violence that they're facing. So what is the level of violence in these communities? So this chart shows the answer to, I think, what is our most important question, which simply asked members of each community. So each one of these names running there across the bottom of the x-axis is the name of one of the 50 partner communities. They're colored to indicate what local government area within each state, either Kaduna or Plateau, they belong in. These local government areas might be thought of as kind of similar to counties in the American setting. And they indicate the number of violent clashes that respondents reported over the last 2 years in their community. So this is just averaged across each partner site. What's the average number of violent events that our respondents reported having experienced in their community in the last 2 years? And there's a couple things you can see from looking at the chart. Number one, the average number across all these communities together is just under 2 events. So 2 events over the last 2 years here. And we've defined for our respondents, by the way, what is a violent event. We said, tell us the number of times that you experienced a clash between people or groups that led to significant bodily harm. So that's what we're asking people to report here. So on average, it's about 2, which to be honest was lower than I expected. But what you can see is that there's quite a lot of variation between the local government areas and the different communities, where communities like Igabe, there on the far left in blue, almost every community there, people said they experienced less than 1 event. Same in Kaduna South, which is a urban community in the south of Kaduna. Igabe is a kind of peri-urban community in the northern part of just north of Kaduna City. And compare that to the relatively high levels of violence in Zango-Kataf, which is a region close to the border of Plateau, where a lot of the herder-farmer violence that has been happening in this region has been taking place. And in that area, you could see the average is more like 6 violent events over the last 2 years. So 6 times more violence in that local government area than in those ones that I just mentioned that are suffering far fewer. So a lot of variation, which from the perspective of our experiment is actually a good thing. It will let us try to figure out the determinants of why violence goes up or down in different communities, including ones that are already very violent or are ones that have less violence. The next thing I want to show is another measure of violence and insecurity, and this is a kind of more subjective measure. So here, instead of asking our respondents to tell us how many violent events they had experienced, we just asked them to tell us how often over the last 5 years, 2 years, they felt they were at significant risk of experiencing violence in their community. And what you're seeing here is the percent of people who said they felt at significant risk at least monthly. So on a monthly basis over the last 2 years, they felt they were at significant risk. And the first thing that you could see from this is that although the number of violent events was relatively low, and the pattern is generally the same between which communities feel insecure and which ones experience more events, the overall number of people who feel insecure on a monthly basis is pretty high. It's close to 30% of respondents in our sample reported feeling insecure on at least a monthly basis. So that suggests that even though the total number of events is not that great in each of these communities, the memory of the violence is long, and people feel insecure quite often in a lot of these communities. And in some of these communities, almost everybody feels insecure almost all of the time. So that suggests there's a lot of work to do, at least in the subjective perception of insecurity in these different areas. Now, we also asked people to tell us when they did witness violence in their community, what kind of violence was it, or what did they see as the main types of violence that occurred in their communities? And I'm showing you here the 5 most common responses that we got, and I'm breaking them down by Muslims and Christians because, as I said, it turns out that's an important distinction, even though, and you can see that from this chart, it doesn't appear that our respondents think that the violence is religiously motivated. You could see that Christians experienced or reported experiencing more of every type of violence, with the exception of ethnic and, or with the exception of religious violence. But those numbers are so small that the differences there are not statistically significant. So the other thing, of course, to take from this is that most of the violence falls into 3 main categories. That's the violence from armed gangs or banditry, as I mentioned earlier, the farmer-herder violence, and the election-related violence, which was not something coded in that Nigeria security tracker data, and actually surprised us just how many people noted that they had witnessed election-related violence. That's obviously something to be quite concerned about going into the presidential elections, which are scheduled for the end of February, I believe, in Nigeria. And it's also an opportunity for Partner to see if they can make a difference in these communities by that time and prepare these communities for what might be violence that takes place around the elections. But again, as you can see, Christians reporting higher levels of all those kinds of violence, but not reporting higher levels of religious violence, which suggests that, again, they see themselves as involved in conflicts with groups that are predominantly Muslim, but they don't necessarily see the conflicts with those groups as being driven by religion per se. Instead, they're conflicts with different religious groups over things that are not identity-based conflicts themselves. And I think that's actually an important thing to emphasize. Okay. The next thing I want to talk about in terms of results from the survey, I think is really quite interesting. And that's because to an extent I didn't appreciate before I got involved in this project. Actually, in this part of Nigeria, other parts of Nigeria as well, but especially here, there have been efforts by the Nigerian government and by local NGOs and other local civil community organizations to establish early warning efforts. And those efforts have been going on for at least a decade in many of the communities that we surveyed. And so one of the questions we asked our respondents was whether they actually had an existing early warning system in their community. And this map shows the percentage of people in each community who said that, yes, they did have an existing formal early warning system set up. And you could see there's some variation in that across the communities. One thing to notice, though, is that there are relatively few communities in which everybody said they had an early warning system, and relatively few in which no one said they had an early warning system, which itself suggests a problem to begin with. And that is that not everyone in the community seems to know whether there really is or is not an early warning system there in the community. And one of the things we're trying to do is get information on the kind of ground truth about that. Where exactly are the systems that have been set up? But one thing, obviously, that we know, given the levels of violence we've seen across all these communities, is that these early warning systems don't seem to have been working, or at least not working very well, because the levels of violence that we see are quite high. And we also know that because we asked our respondents a couple of questions about the kind of warning that they're already getting. And only 23% of our respondents said that they received warning when violence happened in their communities more than half the time. So only about a quarter, less than a quarter, felt like they got warning of violence before it happened at least half the time. And 55% said they never or almost never got warning about violence before it happened. So again, that really indicates, along with the fact that people don't really seem to know whether they've got an early warning system or not, that whatever early warning systems are in existence, they're not working as well as we might have hoped. So where are people getting warnings from, and what information do they trust about where violence is going to occur if it's not from these existing systems? We asked our respondents about that as well. And you can see that here. We asked about these 4 different possible sources where you might get warning. So the blue bars tell you how frequently you get warning. In other words, did you receive warning from that source more than half the time before a violent event happened? And then how much do you trust the accuracy of the warnings that you do receive from those sources? And what you can see is that there's no single source of warning in which more than about a quarter of people said they got warning more than half the time. And certain groups like the police, people said they got warning from the police. Only about 9% of people said they got warning from the police more than half the time before a violent event occurred. Only about 25% said they got warning from friends and family. People also just tended to trust warnings they got from the family much more than they did from the police. And you'll notice this other category there, which I've called vigilantes. That's the name that the local communities often give to these local informal security groups that have sprung up, in part to try to fill the gap in local security left by the police. And what you could see there is that they're actually the most trusted source of information about violent conflict in the communities that we surveyed. And there's a bunch of other evidence we have that I'm not going to present to you today that suggests that people have really been turning to these local security organizations. Again, they're often called vigilantes, although that term doesn't carry the same negative connotation in these communities as it does, I think, in many Western societies. But they've depended more and more on them. And I think almost everybody thinks, at least in the long term, that's not a good thing. These groups are entirely unaccountable. They're operating outside of the law. And increasingly, they've been accused of being involved in some pretty serious human rights abuses of their own. So although these groups are providing some security and people are putting more and more trust in them, I don't think anybody believes that's a long-term solution for these communities. The last thing I'll say, notice very few people are getting information from the internet or social media, and very few people trust the information that they do get from those sources. And in one sense, that's probably a good thing, given how much we know in this country that we probably shouldn't trust information that we get on the internet and social media. But in another sense, I do see that as an opportunity to try to provide some place on the internet or to use technology in some way to distribute warnings in a new way, just because we know that internet and social media actually have quite a lot of reach even in many of these more rural communities. And it's an obvious way, at least, to disseminate some curated information about where violence is likely to occur. And so that's one of the things that our team is working with local communities on right now, trying to figure out what social media platforms people already use, how they use them, and how we might use them to provide information about violence that's collected as part of the broader effort. Okay, one last thing to show you, and then we'll move to your questions and comments, which is with all this data we collected, we can now look at how some of the different factors that we measured influence the amount of violence that people say they are experiencing in their community, or the amount of subjective insecurity that they report. So I looked at 6 different factors just because I thought they were interesting. There's a lot of other factors I could show you here. So, and here we're looking on the left. This data shows the effect of each of these factors on the number of violent events that the respondent is going to report. And on the right, on the risk or the probability that the respondent says that they felt insecure at least monthly over the last 2 years. So those are the same 2 variables I presented earlier, but here we're looking at the effect of these 6 factors on the levels of those variables. And the 6 factors are the sex of the respondent, whether the community has an existing early warning system, how large the community is. The communities, as we showed earlier, vary a lot in size, whether the community is rural versus urban or peri-urban, whether the respondents were Christian or Muslim, and then lastly, whether respondents reported having high levels of trust in other people in their communities. And there's a number of things that I want you to take away from this chart. I'm not going to talk about every result here, but first and foremost, maybe from the perspective of our project, notice that whether the community has an existing early warning system has no significant effect on either of these measures. They both overlap that vertical line, which means we can't be confident that they have any statistically significant effect. In fact, if anything, the effect is positive, meaning people are more likely to report violent events and more likely to feel insecure with these early warning systems in their community. Now, I would say we don't know whether that effect is causal. I certainly hope it's not. And it could be because these early warning systems were established in communities that already had high degrees of violence. That's something we've been careful in our system not to do. So we'll be able to distinguish between the effect of the system and an effect of where the system was chosen to be deployed. But that's the most important thing. These existing systems don't seem to be affecting either of these key measures of violence that we have. Second, you'll see Christian respondents. They reported about half an extra violent event over the past 4 years compared to Muslims. And they were 11% more likely to say that they felt insecure monthly than Muslim respondents were. And then finally, I think that last variable on the bottom of the chart is really quite interesting. And it shows that people who felt that their community could be trusted, that they could trust other members of their community, reported about 0.6 fewer events. And although, again, that might not seem like a high number, remember I said the average number of reported events is just 2 events. And so to move that by 0.6 is actually a pretty significant move in the number of reported events. And they're about 7% less likely to say they felt insecure on a monthly basis than people who didn't trust other groups in their community. So this is just a sense of the kind of effects that we can see in the existing data. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up now and say, what can we conclude to Jim's question about what measures work? What we can conclude right now is, I'm afraid, nothing quite yet. And that's because I didn't do anything yet to show what measures worked, although I think we have some indicators here of some measures that have been tried and have not worked very well so far. But what I hope I did do, along with my collaborators, is to describe a research project that can tell us what worked. And I hope a kind of research design that can tell us what worked, not only here in these communities in Nigeria, elsewhere in Nigeria, but I hope this kind of research design will be a template for other efforts at atrocity prevention of the kind that I hope we'll see more and more in the future, that will allow us to assess whether those measures work in places that are at risk for atrocity around the world. So I'll end there, and I'm very glad to take your questions, as I know are my collaborators who are here on the call with me.
Thanks, Ben. Okay, it looks like we have full screen now. Let me open the floor to questions. If there are additional comments that some of our Mercy Corps colleagues would like to make, I would invite you at this point to chime in.
Yes, Danjuma or Adam, if you're on the call, if there's anything you think I left out that is important to add, I'd love to have your input. There's Danjuma.
So, Ben, the way you presented as if you actually followed us and did the data collection as if you live in those communities, I can't do this presentation better than you in terms of understanding how this evolved, as well as how you are able to explain the variations in terms of the localities, in terms of the different groups that are in those communities, and so on and so forth. Really, you really did a very good job. And so thank you very much. Now I can actually sleep very well, knowing that, yes, we have a very good research that we're going to actually work on. So actually, when we were reading through some of the findings, one of the things that Andrew actually mentioned to me is this is our opportunity to look at those areas whereby it demonstrated where we need to work and concentrate, especially with the early warning response structures, as well as the social cohesion, as well as other issues. So this is really important. I think one of the clarity I want to provide in terms of how we select these communities and why we have these results is because in all these locations, except for the urban areas, except for the rural communities like in Mangu and other locations, these communities prior to now used to live together, but then suddenly as a result of violence and so on and so forth, they relocated. So there's a lot of movement of people within those. So you will find that where you have a minority of a particular ethnic group or religious group, you find them saying things about incidences of violence higher, feeling of incident, because they are a minority. So they feel that if that happens, you know, they are at risk of being caught up in that violence. And that is why, and when you are mentioning those, I was like, yes, exactly. Because the configuration of those communities, we deliberately selected them because of high level of incidence of violence if nothing is done. And with regards to the election, and they actually pointed out that rather than religion, rather than ethnicity, it's actually election-related violence that I'm more afraid of. And they are right, because most of the violence that we see during election are just couched in ethnic and religious, but really it was the election that's made it. And these people are actually attested to that. And so I'm really happy at the outcome of this. So I'll leave it to my colleagues, maybe they'll add something. Thank you very much, Ben and Ore.
Thank you, Dan. I'm glad that that we got it mostly right.
So there's a question in the chat from David Frey.